I never expected the chaos of my life to unfold behind the velvet curtain of a sold-out arena, the scent of guitar strings and sweat thick in the air, the roar of thousands of fans reverberating through the walls. Being a rock star comes with its own set of masks. The public sees the glitz, the leather, the flamboyance. But no one knows the quiet battles you fight in the dressing room, where your reflection stares back at you without a filter, without applause. Tonight, that reflection would take me somewhere I never imagined. The tour manager, a whirlwind of efficiency and caffeine, had a way of slipping me backstage passes for the smaller, hidden experiences. The sound checks no one else attended, the rare moments when the band's chaos became something intimate, almost sacred. But tonight, the manager handed me a thin cardboard box with a wry smile. Inside, nestled in soft tissue, were lace-front wigs, silky, luminous, and impossibly real. The kind of wigs that could transform anyone, erase the boundaries between who they were and who they longed to be, if only for a night. I stared at them like they held a secret code, a key to a version of myself I'd been too terrified to explore. The first wig was platinum, straight, with a shine that reflected the harsh backstage lights. My hands trembled as I picked it up. I could hear the faint murmur of the crowd outside, oblivious to the private experiment I was about to embark upon. There was a thrill, a tremor of fear, but more than that, a longing. How many times had I envied those women on stage, their freedom to be someone entirely different, yet entirely themselves. I started with small steps, brushing my fingers along the wig, feeling its unnatural perfection against my palms. Then, as if some invisible cue had been whispered, I lifted it over my head. Hair tumbled over my shoulders like liquid silver, and I caught my reflection. My own eyes, wide and questioning, stared back from beneath a fringe of lace. There was disbelief, yes, but also something else. A flicker of recognition, of authenticity I'd never allowed myself to see. The next moments blurred as I experimented with makeup, a subtle smudge of liner, a stroke of blush, and each movement transformed me incrementally, layer by delicate layer. It wasn't a costume. It wasn't a joke. It was me, finally visible to myself in a way that felt dangerous, thrilling, liberating. There was a thrill in the secrecy, a pulse of adrenaline that matched the bass vibrating through the floorboards. I felt like a magician stepping into her own spell, unsure if the magic would vanish when the lights came on, or if it would stay, stubborn and resilient, like it had always been waiting for me. And then the door creaked. I froze, heart hammering. A shadow fell across the dressing room floor. It was one of the bandmates, a notorious prankster who could never resist backstage mysteries. But instead of laughter, his face showed something else, curiosity, admiration, maybe even a spark of understanding. "Whoa," he said softly, as if speaking louder might shatter the delicate spell I'd created. "You look different, but like you." I laughed nervously, tucking a stray strand behind my ear, suddenly aware of the trembling in my chest. "It's new," I admitted, voice low. I wasn't sure if it was new to him or new to me. And in that moment, I realized that transformation wasn't just about wigs or makeup. It was about confronting the parts of myself I had kept hidden, the secret corners where I felt both powerless and powerful at the same time. By the time the first song started echoing through the hall, the wig perched perfectly, the eyeliner sharp and unyielding. I felt an odd sense of balance. The backstage shadows no longer felt threatening. They felt like allies, like witnesses to a truth I hadn't dared to acknowledge. The roaring crowd outside might never know, but inside, in that dimly lit room of mirrors and whispered chords, I was finally beginning to understand what it meant to be fully, unapologetically myself, even if only for a fleeting, electric night. The adrenaline from the first brush with transformation lingered, making my hands jitter slightly even as I tried to appear calm. I watched my reflection again, tracing the line of my jaw, the curve of my cheek, the way the wig framed my face like a halo of daring. There was something hypnotic about seeing yourself as someone else, and yet feeling entirely yourself, like the edges of reality had softened, and the backstage mirrors were a portal into a secret world I had never been brave enough to enter. I didn't hear him leave. Maybe he lingered, maybe he had disappeared into the chaos of amps, cables, and forgotten set lists. I didn't care. My attention was consumed by experimentation. slipping into clothes I would never dare wear publicly, mixing textures and colors that contrasted with the familiar leather jackets and ripped jeans that had become my uniform. A sequined vest shimmered under the dim light. A soft silk scarf hung loosely around my neck. I twisted in front of the mirror, fascinated by how fabric could change posture, presence, even attitude. I wasn't performing. I was discovering. Hours or maybe minutes, time had become irrelevant. Passed as I practiced movement, the subtle sway of a hip, the tilt of a shoulder, the way a wrist could suggest elegance without saying a word. It was intoxicating. Each glance in the mirror made me feel lighter, more complete. I laughed at myself when I caught a sudden shyness in my own eyes, a hesitation I hadn't noticed in years. But that hesitation didn't sting, it fascinated me. It was a signal, a reminder that transformation was not just about appearance, but about vulnerability, courage, and the willingness to be witnessed. The sound of footsteps made me jump. It was the stylist, a whirlwind of brushes and fabric and experience, a person I had always seen as an enabler of superficial beauty. But tonight, she paused at the door, eyebrows raised, clearly unsure if she should interrupt. Instead, she lingered, studying me with the curiosity of someone who had just stumbled upon something sacred. "That wig, it suits you," she said finally, voice quiet, almost reverent. "Not like a costume, like you've been waiting to wear it." Her words struck deeper than I expected. Waiting. Yes, I had been waiting. Waiting behind guitars, behind tour schedules, behind the carefully curated chaos of rock and roll life. Waiting for a moment that would feel both forbidden and necessary. Waiting for permission I had never needed. And somehow, seeing myself reflected in lace and silk and sequins made the waiting worth it. My mind began to drift toward the stage. I could hear the faint hum of the crowd beyond the thick doors, the anticipation buzzing like electricity in my chest. Part of me wanted to stay hidden, to savor the quiet intimacy of discovery. But another part, a braver, louder part, wanted to step into the unknown, to bring this new version of myself into a world that would never expect it. My fingers brushed the wig one last time, adjusting the lace at the hairline, feeling the delicate tension of transformation as if it were alive, like it had a heartbeat that matched mine. I took a deep breath, and for a moment everything paused. I imagined walking onto the stage like this, platinum hair shimmering under the lights, sequins catching the reflections of spotlights, every eye on me without understanding why I looked different, why I felt different. And then the surge hit, the rush of possibility that comes with walking past fear into a space where the audience doesn't yet know who you are, but you know finally who you are. And just as my pulse began to settle into a steady rhythm of anticipation, I heard the unmistakable click of the dressing room door. My heart leapt. It was him again, the bandmate whose presence had once made me nervous with the threat of judgment, now felt like a tether to reality, a witness to my metamorphosis. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The silence was acknowledgement, a tacit agreement that whatever was happening here was important, delicate, and unshakably real. I realized then that transformation wasn't a one-time event. It was a thread, weaving through moments, choices, glances, and reflections. Each movement, each decision, each layer of lace and makeup was a stitch in a new identity, one I had never dared to live, but one I now understood was as much a part of me as the voice that crooned into microphones night after night. I smiled at my reflection, a small, private triumph shining in my eyes. This was only the beginning. The hum of the crowd seeped through the walls, a distant, persistent thrum that felt both comforting and intimidating. I had spent years performing for them as a rock star, channeling energy into the music, the stage persona, the roar of thousands, but tonight the adrenaline carried a different flavor, a blend of fear, exhilaration, and revelation. I touched the wig again, adjusting a stray strand, feeling its unnatural softness, almost as if it were a living thing guiding me toward something I had longed for but had never dared to claim. I peeked through the small window of the backstage door. The arena lights glimmered in abstract patterns, shadows dancing along the edges of the stage. I could see silhouettes moving, the crew adjusting cables, the drummer doing warm-ups, all oblivious to the small, private metamorphosis occurring just a few feet away. The idea of stepping out into that world as this new version of myself was terrifying, but the thrill outweighed the fear. Every fiber of me was alive with the potential of revelation. I began to walk, cautiously at first, toward the mirror that stretched across the wall of the dressing room. My reflection followed, taut and alert, the wig catching the light in waves. I tilted my head, experimented with expressions, with the subtle arch of an eyebrow, the tilt of a chin. There was something magnetic in the act of watching yourself transform incrementally, like a sculptor discovering shapes hidden within stone. I practiced smiles, subtle glances, even the way I would move my hands when the audience focused on me. These small gestures suddenly felt as meaningful as the music itself. Then came the knock on the door. My pulse quickened. "You ready?" It was the tour manager, tone casual but carrying the weight of someone who sensed change. I hesitated, realizing that this moment required courage I wasn't sure I possessed. "Yeah," I whispered, adjusting the scarf around my neck, smoothing the sequined vest. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange mixture of vulnerability and empowerment. What I was about to do could not be undone, and in that knowledge, there was a kind of sacred intensity that made my heart pound with anticipation. As I stepped out into the corridor, the cool air brushing my face felt electric. The lights above flickered slightly, illuminating the hair that fell in luminous waves down my shoulders, highlighting the subtle shimmer of makeup that I had applied with trembling hands. Crew members passed by, offering brief nods or distracted glances, unaware of the private transformation I carried like a secret talisman. I kept my head high, my posture deliberate, walking with a balance of nervousness and confidence that surprised me. The edge of the stage approached, a thin strip of floor separating the backstage shadows from the incandescent glow of the arena. I paused at the threshold, one hand lightly brushing the edge of the curtain, feeling its weight as if it were a boundary between worlds. Behind me, the mirrors reflected a version of myself that had once been invisible. Ahead, the lights promised exposure, scrutiny, and yet, inexplicably, freedom. I stepped through, the roar of the crowd washing over me in waves, my pulse syncing with the booming bass. The energy was intoxicating. I could feel the audience's gaze, though they could not see the subtle changes beneath the surface, the intricacies of identity woven into lace and silk. Each chord I played, each lyric I sang, felt infused with a newfound authenticity, a daring honesty that transcended music. I felt alive in ways that stage personas had never allowed before, the liberation of stepping fully into a self that had always existed but had been confined, hidden behind layers of expectation. Then, during the instrumental break, I caught a glimpse of myself in the reflection of a polished speaker, a fragment of Backstage mirrored elsewhere. The platinum wig framed my face perfectly, the sequins catching the light, and for a moment, I didn't feel like a rock star at all. I felt like someone entirely new, someone whole. The audience continued their rhythmic applause, unaware that their cheers were not just for music, but for the emergence of a secret self that had taken its first bold step into visibility. I realized something profound. Transformation wasn't about hiding or disguising. It was about discovery. It was about the courage to step into the spaces that terrified you, to embrace the parts of yourself that had been quieted for years. And as the final notes of the song resonated through the arena, I felt a quiet thrill of certainty. I had found something on that backstage floor, amidst lace wigs and soft scarves, that no spotlight, no applause, and no expectation could ever take away. Backstage, after the set ended and the applause still echoed faintly through the walls, I felt a peculiar emptiness mixed with exhilaration. The adrenaline had faded, leaving only the quiet hum of the dressing room lights and the lingering scent of sweat, hair products, and stage polish. I sank into the chair in front of the mirror, running my fingers through the wig and tracing the subtle line where lace met skin. There was an intimacy to the act, a private acknowledgement that what I had done out there wasn't a performance, it was revelation. I thought about the crowd, the roaring faces I could never truly see, and the odd thrill of knowing that they had experienced a version of me I had barely allowed myself to witness. This identity, this backstage alter ego, wasn't an escape. It was a lens, a prism through which I could explore facets of myself that had always been hidden behind leather jackets and microphone stands. I touched my reflection, almost reverently, as if it were a fragile artifact I had unearthed. The stylist returned, carrying a tray of brushes and makeup. She studied me for a moment, eyes soft, and then without a word began tidying the wig, smoothing the edges, ensuring that the transformation remained seamless. Her presence felt comforting, a quiet affirmation that this wasn't a fleeting indulgence. She had witnessed countless backstage experiments, but there was something different tonight, something that hinted at honesty, at a vulnerability that demanded recognition rather than judgment. I thought about my bandmates. Some had been close, some distant, but none had ever seen this side of me. The thought of their reactions was intoxicatingly scary. Would they laugh? Would they understand? Would the unspoken bonds of friendship endure this revelation? And yet, even as these questions pressed against the edges of my mind, there was a strange liberation in knowing that this was my choice alone, a secret theater where the script was mine to write. Hours passed, and the dressing room emptied gradually. Crew members came and went, adjusting lighting, packing away cables, oblivious to the quiet drama unfolding in the corner of the room. I lingered in front of the mirror, experimenting with poses, expressions, even subtle gestures I might adopt on stage. There was a grace to the movement, a rhythm I hadn't realized I was capable of. Each subtle shift felt like a stitch in a tapestry of identity, weaving together courage, curiosity, and authenticity. Then came the unexpected sound of laughter, a soft, warm chuckle from the doorway. I froze, heart leaping. It was him again, the bandmate who had first acknowledged my transformation without judgment. He stepped inside cautiously, hands raised slightly in apology for interrupting. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said, voice gentle. "But wow, you look incredible, not like a costume, like this is you." The words struck me harder than I expected. For so long, I had lived in shadows, performing versions of myself that were safe, socially acceptable, or simply expected. Hearing someone recognize the authenticity of this self, someone whose approval I hadn't consciously sought, felt like a soft but powerful affirmation. It wasn't validation I needed, but acknowledgement. And in that acknowledgement, I felt a rush of courage that made the room seem smaller, more intimate, more sacred. He lingered, neither judging nor stepping away, simply observing. His presence was grounding, a tether to the world I had always known, while simultaneously encouraging me to explore a world I had only glimpsed in reflection. I realized then that transformation was not a solitary act. It was relational, existing in the interplay between who you are, who you want to be, and who is willing to see you without fear or ridicule. I smiled at him, a quiet, private victory shining in my eyes. "Thanks," I said, voice soft, almost vulnerable. "It's new, but it feels right." He nodded, a subtle smile spreading across his face, and left without another word, leaving me alone with my reflection once more. But now, the mirror felt different. The reflection staring back at me wasn't just a disguise or a fantasy. It was a declaration, a proof that who I had been waiting to become had finally emerged, delicate yet undeniable, shimmering in lace and silk and soft platinum strands. The night stretched on, empty corridors echoing with the distant hum of departing fans and the soft clatter of crew cleaning up the remnants of the show. I remained in the dressing room, the wig now feeling like an extension of me rather than an adornment. I traced my fingers along the lace at the hairline, marveling at the way something so delicate could feel so powerful. Each strand, each shimmering lock, carried a weight I hadn't anticipated, the weight of self-realization, of owning a version of myself I had long hidden. I began to experiment with movement again, shifting weight from one foot to the other, letting the sequined vest catch the dim light, feeling the silk scarf slide across my skin. There was a rhythm, almost musical, in the way the new persona flowed through me. It was as if each motion reaffirmed something I had suppressed for years, that identity was not fixed, and that I could inhabit it fully, even in a world that demanded conformity. The sense of liberation was tempered by fear, subtle but persistent. What would happen if someone discovered this version of me? What would the media say? What would my fans think? I shook my head, trying to banish the thoughts. This wasn't about performance or approval, it was about truth. It was about stepping into a space that had always been mine, but had been denied for reasons I couldn't fully articulate until now. The fear was necessary, in a way. It sharpened the thrill, made every gesture and glance more vivid, more meaningful. I caught a glimpse of a photo on the dressing room counter, an old promotional shot of the band, all of us in leather and denim, frozen in a pose that screamed confidence, coolness, safety. I smiled wryly. Tonight, that image felt distant, almost like a costume I had outgrown. The reflection in the mirror was no longer just a reflection. It was a challenge, a promise, an invitation to step beyond what I had always accepted as myself. There was a knock on the door, soft and hesitant. I froze, the wig slipping slightly as I turned. It was the sound of someone unsure, someone curious but cautious. I opened the door a crack and found the tour photographer, camera in hand, eyes wide but respectful. I don't want to intrude," he said, voice low, "but wow, can I take a picture?" The request startled me, but the reaction inside was unexpected. I didn't feel exposed. I felt seen. I nodded slowly, and he stepped in, framing the shot with care, as if capturing a sacred moment rather than a celebrity experiment. The flash illuminated the platinum strands, the subtle makeup, the shimmer of the vest. It froze me in a way that was both thrilling and grounding, proof that this transformation, this version of me, existed in the world, even if only quietly, even if only in a photograph that might never be published. After he left, I sank back into the chair, the adrenaline replaced by a quiet reflection. Transformation was not about costume or appearance alone. It was about inhabiting a truth, feeling it in the spine, the posture, the eyes. Each glance in the mirror reinforced the idea that identity could be layered, fluid, and profound, and that it could emerge in spaces as unexpected as a backstage dressing room, under the glare of fluorescent lights and the weight of expectation. The rest of the night passed in soft experimentation. I tried on different wigs, layered scarves in unusual ways, explored subtle changes in makeup, each choice a brushstroke in a painting of self-discovery. The more I explored, the more I realized that the act of cross-dressing, of adopting these personas, wasn't about performance or illusion. It was about articulation. It was a language through which I could speak the parts of myself that had always existed, quietly, patiently, waiting to be expressed. By the time the first rays of dawn crept through the backstage windows, I felt a deep sense of peace. The wig lay slightly tousled on my shoulders, sequins catching the last flicker of light. My reflection smiled back at me, confident, calm, transformed, not as a spectacle, but as a declaration. For the first time, I understood that backstage transformations were not about hiding. They were about revealing, quietly and intentionally, who we are beneath the expectations, the fame, and the stage personas that have defined us for so long. The next morning, the dressing room felt different. Sunlight filtered in through the high windows, painting the walls in soft gold, and I could see the traces of last night's experiment in the faint glitter dust on the floor and the crumpled scarves on the chair. Everything seemed ordinary, yet charged with memory, as if the room itself had absorbed the energy of the transformation. I traced the edges of the wig with my fingertips, feeling the delicate lace, the silky strands, and realized that it had become more than a prop. It had become a companion, a witness, a silent affirmation of courage I hadn't known I possessed. I dressed in my usual band attire, leather and denim, feeling the familiar weight of identity I had carried on stage for years. But something had shifted. There was a new awareness in the way I moved, a subtle confidence, a lightness that wasn't there before. The platinum wig, the scarves, the sequins, they weren't just costumes. They were portals, revealing parts of myself that had been quietly waiting for acknowledgement. I felt a strange gratitude for the small acts of rebellion, for the courage to play with identity, to see myself differently, and to allow that vision to persist even after the wig came off. Rehearsals were grueling, the same as always, yet the music sounded different. Not louder, not faster, but somehow more alive. I found myself experimenting with subtle gestures on stage, minute changes in posture and movement that carried traces of the alter ego I had explored the night before. It was almost imperceptible to anyone else, but I could feel it. The thrill of inhabiting a self that existed beyond expectation, a self that was neither hidden nor performed, but fully present in the rhythm of the music and the space around me. During a break, the stylist appeared with a new lace wig in a darker shade, soft brown this time, with gentle waves that promised a different personality entirely. My pulse quickened. The night before had been an awakening, This new opportunity felt like an invitation to explore further, to experiment with facets of identity I hadn't even realized were there. I hesitated only for a moment before lifting the wig and feeling the silky strands cascade over my shoulders. There was a magic in the touch, a quiet thrill, a sense that this version of me could exist freely, at least in these sacred backstage moments. The bandmate who had first acknowledged me appeared again, leaning casually against the doorframe. "You're serious about this, huh?" he asked, eyebrows raised but smile warm. "Not just a one-night thing." I nodded, smiling, feeling a subtle pride that surprised me. "It's something I want to explore," I admitted softly. His eyes gleamed with a mix of curiosity and understanding, and for the first time I realized that being seen in truth wasn't terrifying. It could be affirming, even healing. We spent the next few hours in quiet collaboration. He suggested subtle ways to integrate gestures and expressions I had discovered into my stage presence, and I realized that the transformation wasn't confined to wigs and makeup. It could influence my entire demeanor, my connection with music, with space, with others. Each adjustment felt like a conversation between who I had always been and who I was becoming, a dialogue that was thrilling, scary, and exhilarating all at once. By the evening, the arena lights blazed once more, and I stepped onto the stage with the brown wig in place, a new persona quietly woven into the familiar rhythms of performance. The audience roared as usual, unaware that tonight's show carried a hidden significance for me, a private triumph of identity and courage. Every chord, every movement, felt infused with a deeper awareness, a confidence that came not from applause or recognition, but from the quiet acknowledgement that I had claimed a part of myself that had long been waiting for discovery. Backstage, after the performance, I finally allowed myself to linger in front of the mirror, running my fingers through the waves of the brown wig and letting the reflection absorb me completely. It was no longer a mere experiment. It was revelation. It was freedom. And in that quiet room, surrounded by the echoes of music and applause, I understood that transformation was not an end, but a journey I was only beginning to embrace fully. The days that followed became a delicate dance between worlds, the public rock star and the private explorer. On stage, I returned to the familiar persona that fans adored, commanding attention with guitar riffs and booming vocals. Offstage, I nurtured the secret realm of transformation, the quiet hours spent experimenting with wigs, scarves, and subtle gestures that allowed me to inhabit identities I had never dared to explore. Each version of myself, platinum, brown, or even darker tones I hadn't tried yet, carried a unique energy, a mood, a story. And with every choice, I felt more whole. The stylist became an unexpected ally, a confidant who approached this exploration not as a novelty, but as a serious art form. She encouraged me to play with layers, textures, and expressions, guiding me to discover subtleties in posture, in the tilt of the head, in the curve of a smile that I had never noticed in myself. With her help, the backstage mirror transformed from a tool into a sanctuary, a safe space where identity could be molded, reshaped, and embraced without judgment. One evening, after a particularly exhausting show, I lingered in the dressing room longer than usual. The arena lights had dimmed, the stage was silent, and the distant hum of departing fans had faded into an almost meditative stillness. I sat before the mirror, the latest wig, a rich auburn cascade of soft curls, resting lightly on my shoulders. My reflection looked back at me, not as a disguise, but as an invitation. I experimented with expressions, laughing softly at the sudden awareness that my features seemed different, yet unmistakably mine. The door opened quietly and the bandmate appeared once more holding 2 mugs of coffee. "Late-night reflection session?" he asked with a teasing grin. I smiled, a warmth spreading through me. "Something like that," I admitted. He sat on the edge of the chair, not intruding but simply offering company. His presence was grounding, reminding me that transformation wasn't about isolation. It was relational. It existed not just in mirrors and wigs, but in the quiet acknowledgement of those willing to see you without judgment. We sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, sipping coffee. Finally, he spoke, voice low. "I've never seen anyone embrace themselves like this. Not just on stage, not just in private. It's beautiful, brave." The words struck me. I had thought courage was measured by riffs, by standing before thousands, by surviving the chaos of fame. But here, in a quiet backstage room, courage took on a different shape. It was subtle. It was intimate. It was refusing to hide, even in the smallest moments, even in ways no one else might ever notice. The auburn wig framed my face perfectly, the curls catching the dim light. I practiced subtle gestures, the tilt of a chin, the soft flick of a wrist, discovering that transformation was not simply cosmetic, it was kinetic. It moved through body and spirit, rippling outward into posture, presence, and confidence. For the first time, I understood that identity was fluid, malleable, and profoundly personal. It wasn't a mask or performance. It was exploration, expression, liberation. By the end of the night, I carefully removed the wig, laying it gently on the counter. I studied my reflection, noticing subtle changes in the way I carried myself, the way my eyes held a new quiet confidence. Transformation, I realized, wasn't a single act. It was cumulative, a thread weaving through hours, days, and nights, forming patterns of self-awareness and self-acceptance that no one could erase. Even when the wigs came off, even when the stage lights faded, the transformation remained, quiet, potent, and undeniably real. And so I began to plan. Different wigs, new textures, subtle expressions yet to explore. Each experiment was a step, each reflection a guide, each movement a declaration. I had discovered a world that existed not in the glare of public attention, but in the intimacy of mirrors, fabrics, and delicate lace. A world where I could finally see myself in full, nuanced color, unafraid, unapologetic, and ready for the next stage of discovery. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of the tour became a backdrop to a more profound personal journey. I found myself anticipating the quiet moments backstage almost as much as the performances themselves. The arena lights, the roaring fans, the electrifying energy, they were exhilarating, yes. But the dressing room, the mirror, the wigs, the scarves, they had become sacred. Each wig represented a different mood, a different version of myself, and each time I slid one over my head, I felt as if I were stepping into a story only I could tell. The platinum wig became bold, daring, a version of myself unafraid to be noticed, even if only in subtle gestures and expressions. The brown waves carried warmth and quiet confidence, a more reflective, thoughtful side. And the auburn curls suggested playfulness, experimentation, and delight in movement. Each transformation carried its own nuances, and I learned to navigate them not as a costume or act, but as living extensions of selfhood. Each reflection revealed something new, something I hadn't known I carried within me all along. One evening, after a particularly intense performance, I lingered in front of the mirror longer than usual. The adrenaline had faded, replaced by a calm I had never experienced backstage before. I tried a new wig, a deep chestnut, almost black, straight and sleek, and applied subtle makeup, focusing on minimalism rather than extravagance. As I tilted my head, experimented with expressions, I caught sight of my reflection and paused. For the first time, I saw all the transformations merging, not as separate personas, but as threads weaving a single, complex identity. The bandmate appeared in the doorway, hesitant but curious, a small smile on his face. "You're evolving," he said softly. "It's like every time you do this, you find a new part of yourself." I nodded, words failing me for a moment. He wasn't teasing, wasn't judging. He was acknowledging something profound, and that acknowledgement mattered more than applause or recognition ever could. I realized then that the journey of transformation was not just about wigs or makeup. It was about being fully seen, even if only by one person who mattered. I experimented further, letting my movements shift subtly as I explored the new wig. The way I walked, the tilt of my chin, the gentle sway of my shoulders, all of it felt infused with intention, a deliberate articulation of self. I began to understand that transformation wasn't about escaping reality. It was about inhabiting it more fully, more honestly, more vividly. Each wig, each gesture, each reflection was a step toward a more authentic version of myself, and each step carried a quiet exhilaration. Days turned into nights, and the backstage rituals became essential. I developed a rhythm, performance, reflection, exploration. Sometimes I allowed myself to linger in a wig after the crowd had gone, practicing subtle gestures, experimenting with posture, and discovering nuances in expression that revealed new dimensions of self. Each session felt like a conversation between who I had been, who I was, and who I could become. It was thrilling, terrifying, and profoundly liberating all at once. Then came a moment that shifted everything. During a quiet sound check, the photographer appeared again, camera in hand. "Can I capture this?" he asked, gesturing toward the chestnut wig, the subtle expressions I had been experimenting with. I hesitated, then nodded. The camera clicked, freezing a moment in time that felt intimate, fragile, and infinitely significant. In that instant, I realized that transformation could exist in memory, in documentation, in acknowledgement, even if the wider world never saw it. It wasn't performance. It was truth. By the time the band returned to rehearsals, I felt a quiet certainty settling within me. Transformation was not a secret to be hidden, nor a curiosity to be indulged in private. It was a living, evolving declaration of self, an act of courage, of play, and of discovery. And I understood that the lace wigs, the scarves, the mirrors, they were more than tools. They were guides, companions, and witnesses to a journey I was only beginning to explore fully. It was during a quiet moment on the tour bus that the full impact of the transformation hit me. The rigors of performance, the constant travel, the demands of fame, they had all faded into the background. What remained was the quiet knowledge that I had unlocked a door to parts of myself I had long ignored. I sat in the narrow aisle, the chestnut wig now carefully stored, and traced the curve of my fingers along the strap of the scarf I had brought with me. Each accessory, each wig, each small gesture carried the weight of self-discovery. Like breadcrumbs leading me through a maze I had been navigating unconsciously for years. The bus rocked gently as we sped down a highway bathed in the gold of late afternoon sun. I stared out the window, lost in reflection. I realized that transformation wasn't merely an act, it was a lens through which I could see the world differently. Each time I dressed, each time I looked into the mirror, I wasn't hiding or performing. I was articulating, layer by layer, the nuances of identity that had been silenced or ignored. The feeling was profound, almost sacred, a quiet revelation that pulsed through my chest like a heartbeat of its own. That night backstage at the next venue, I allowed myself to linger longer than usual. The crew had cleared most of the equipment, and the space felt intimate, private, almost holy. I tried a new wig, a soft, golden brown, shoulder length with natural waves. I applied subtle makeup, focusing on the small details, the flick of eyeliner, the curve of blush, the gentle shadow that emphasized my cheekbones. As I studied the reflection, I realized that each transformation had its own personality, its own rhythm, its own story. They weren't just appearances, they were languages through which I could express the silent depths of myself. The bandmate appeared again, almost like a guardian of these moments. "I've noticed something," he said softly, leaning against the doorframe. "You're not just playing with appearances anymore, you're exploring who you are, and it's incredible to watch." His words were steady, without judgment, carrying a sincerity that struck a chord deep within me. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, realizing that he was right. This wasn't mere curiosity or whimsy. It was an essential, transformative journey, one that had been waiting patiently for me to claim it. I experimented with posture, with the subtleties of facial expression. I found that the golden brown wig encouraged gentleness, a soft confidence, a quiet assertion of presence. It moved differently than the platinum or chestnut versions. My gestures became more fluid, more deliberate, as if the wig itself guided my body toward authenticity. The realization dawned on me fully. Transformation was not just visual. It was kinetic, emotional, psychological. It infused everything. How I walked, how I breathed, how I interacted with space and reflection. Hours later, as I removed the wig and stored it carefully, I felt a deep sense of continuity. Transformation was not a moment. It was a thread weaving through my life, stitching together courage, curiosity, and identity into a tapestry that was uniquely mine. Each wig, each reflection, each subtle gesture became a ritual, a meditation, a declaration. I was no longer hiding, no longer performing, no longer constrained by expectation. I was alive in the quiet moments, as much as I was on stage. And that night, as I lay in the quiet darkness of my hotel room, I realized the final truth. Transformation was not about disguise, performance, or spectacle. It was about discovery, about courage, about claiming the parts of yourself that had been patiently waiting and allowing them to live fully, even if only in private, even if only in fleeting moments. The lace wigs, the scarves, the mirrors, they were not just tools. They were allies, guides, witnesses, and friends in a journey I had only just begun to embrace. The tour had reached its climax, a sold-out arena pulsing with anticipation, and yet my mind was half elsewhere, backstage, in that private world I had cultivated over weeks of quiet exploration. The chaos of music, lights, and screaming fans was familiar, comforting even, but my heart now belonged just as much to the small, sacred spaces of mirrors, wigs, and scarves. I had come to understand that transformation was not an occasional indulgence. It was an essential rhythm of my being, as vital as breath, as essential as music itself. That evening, I chose a wig that was a deep mahogany, sleek and flowing, with a subtle shine that caught the stage lights in ways that seemed almost intentional. As I brushed it through my fingers, I felt a pulse of anticipation. Not fear, not performance, but presence. Every step I took backstage carried the weight and the lightness of revelation. I adjusted my scarf, applied the final touches of makeup, and studied the reflection one last time before stepping into the bright glare of the arena. The moment I stepped on stage, I felt an energy unlike any I had experienced before. The crowd roared as always, but it was no longer the applause I sought. The thrill came from within, from the knowledge that I was fully, unapologetically inhabiting a self that had existed quietly, patiently, waiting for its turn to be recognized. My movements were infused with intention, each gesture a reflection of confidence, exploration, and courage. The music flowed through me differently now. It carried a resonance of authenticity, a vibration that was as much about identity as it was about sound. Backstage, between songs, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a polished speaker. The mahogany wig framed my face perfectly, the soft shimmer of makeup highlighting features I had never allowed myself to notice. For a brief moment, the world outside, the fame, the fans, the chaos, fell away. I saw only myself, whole, complex, alive. The transformation that had begun with curiosity, with a simple wig in a quiet dressing room, had become a language, a tool, a revelation. I was no longer performing a persona. I was inhabiting a self that was fully mine. Later, after the last note faded and the arena emptied, I returned to the dressing room. The silence was profound, a balm after the intensity of the night. I carefully removed the wig, laying it gently on the counter alongside the other companions of this journey. Platinum, brown, auburn, golden, and now mahogany. Each one carried its own story, its own energy, its own truth. I studied them all, realizing that transformation had never been about hiding or escaping. It was about claiming, expressing, and integrating the many facets of myself that had long existed in shadows. I thought about the bandmate who had quietly witnessed these transformations, whose presence had been grounding and affirming. I realized that transformation was relational too. It thrived not only in mirrors and wigs, but in acknowledgement, in trust, in the willingness to see and support another's journey. Courage, I understood now, was both personal and shared. It was private discovery and public acknowledgement, vulnerability and confidence intertwined. Finally, I sat in the chair, bare of wigs and scarves, and studied my reflection one last time before leaving. The room smelled faintly of hairspray and fabric, of leather and echoes of applause. I smiled softly, a quiet triumph shining in my eyes. Transformation had become a living, breathing part of me, a journey without end, a revelation without limits. I realized with profound clarity that I was no longer confined by expectation, by fear, or by the stage persona I had once thought defined me. I was whole, I was evolving, I was finally unmistakably myself. And as I turned off the lights and walked through the empty corridors, the lace wigs and scarves left in quiet repose, I felt a deep and lasting truth. Transformation isn't about disguise. It isn't about performance. It is about discovery, courage, and the audacity to let every facet of yourself live fully, unapologetically, beautifully. And I knew with certainty that this journey, my journey, was only just beginning.